Good morning. You're listening to Radio Maria. Trying to speak at the moment to Marga Ortigas, renowned journalist from the Philippines. Just experiencing a few technical issues, but please bear with us. Marga's an award-winning journalist, and I really want to be able to hear some of her stories. I don't know whether, Marga, you can say something now and whether it will come through.
Yes, and a very good morning to you as you wake up over there on that side of the world. Thank you for having me. I'm very, very pleased to be here.
Oh, it's really, really wonderful. Whereabouts are you at the moment?
I am in Manila right now, right in the heart of the summer season here, so it's quite warm.
Quite warm. I have very fond memories of Manila. My cousin's wife is from Cebu.
Right.
And then after they got married, after initially living in an area of England called Great Yarmouth, which isn't very glamorous.
Right.
Apologies to our listeners from Great Yarmouth. They then went and lived in Alabang Village, which when I was a lawyer in Hong Kong, I went and stayed with them, and I loved all the Christmas displays. And then just, eating my body weight every day in Manila was great fun.
That's amazing. So you were a lawyer in Hong Kong.
I was, yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is quite a change then.
It is quite a change. Yeah, my life is quite different now to how it was.
Much happier.
Well, I wasn't unhappy, but
Right.
but I was searching for a little bit more. And
I understand.
then I found it in
Understand.
the Dominicans.
Completely understand.
Yeah. And where did you grow up, Marga?
I grew up in the Philippines, and then I spent 10 years in the UK, actually. I was based out of London, but as I was already a working journalist, I traveled a lot from London, with London as the base.
Yeah.
I went to the Middle East, went across Europe, and then I came back to the Philippines 2006, perhaps, when we launched a whole new network, a whole new international channel, and I set up the bureau in the Philippines. It was one of the hubs for Asia. So,
Yeah. And did you feel that in that time away from the Philippines that things had changed much?
Yes and no, in many ways. There was a lot of progress in terms of development, that's for sure. The city has become a beast of a city, comparable to Hong Kong and Singapore even. There's just skyscrapers everywhere. The roads are just stretching further and further away from what used to be downtown. So it's a massive city of close to 15 million people, if you can imagine that. And it's spread out across kilometers and kilometers of flatland and riverbank. So it is much bigger than I remember it to be. There's a lot more people coming here now from abroad who are working here. It's still a very deeply faithful country, as I'm sure you know. So Catholicism is still the main religion of majority of the population. So that hasn't changed at all. I mean, that's just so deeply ingrained, I think, in who the Filipino is that I can't imagine that changing anytime soon.
Yeah.
Yes.
And where did the sort of the desire to tell stories and to go into journalism, where did that and when did that first develop in you?
I think it was always there because I was an only child for my parents for 4 years, which meant that, and I had no cousins my age where I was growing up, where I was living. So you kind of have to play on your own, which means you're telling yourself stories constantly, be it playing with dolls or playing with pillows or playing amongst the plants. You have to keep yourself entertained because it's not like you watch television all the time, which I'm very grateful they didn't do that. So you let your creativity roam, which means I had to keep myself busy telling myself stories. And then, as I'm sure you remember from your time in Manila, the traffic here is legendary.
Yes.
Which means when you're sitting in the car and you're just looking out the window, there is nothing else to do except, well, for me at least, I made up stories about the people in the next vehicle, or I'd watch people in the bus stop and then imagine what their day was like. And I just kind of kept myself entertained like that. So when I did eventually have siblings, I, whether they wanted me to or not, regaled them with tales of young detective, or a baker who was only 8 years old, or I just came up with all sorts of different stories to keep them amused and possibly annoyed. And it just went from there. I just really enjoyed telling stories. And back then, actually, there was a very popular cartoon series, which was the greatest stories ever told. And it was stories from the Bible, and it was on TV on Saturday mornings. And I absolutely loved that cartoon. It was a cartoon, and growing up in a Catholic country, you take it for granted that everybody is Catholic. And then you have Saturday morning cartoons which feature stories from the Bible, and you're just convinced the whole world is Catholic. So it was actually quite a shock to me to get older and realize, oh, yeah, no, there is a much wider, broader world out there than the one that we grew up in.
Yeah, that's I relate to that a lot, as I'm an only child. Like, my mother had me quite late in life. She was 41, and yeah, I don't have any siblings. Although in entering religious life now, I have a whole load of siblings. So we fixed that problem. But I would even sort of imagine in my head that one day my mother was just going to reveal to me a brother or sister who was out there who I didn't know. But I had a very lively imagination and would create lots of stories in my head in sort of time at home alone. This is not supposed to be a sob story. I'm not sort of although if it prompts listeners to donate more money for the Radio Maria in the Philippines because they feel sad about my childhood, like I'll work with that. But no, it was a very happy childhood. But yeah, as an only child, I think it does engage the imagination more. Yes,
exactly.
And so, how you go from this, storyteller child into journalism itself?
I kind of fell into it really because I was, and it connects back to the UK. I was still at school. I was in university. I did my first degree here in Manila, and I was studying communication arts. And I wanted to get people that I knew. A girl that I had gone to school with was going to star in a West End musical. We were 17 years old. It was a big break. It was the first time a Filipino lead in a West End musical. And I just thought, I want to go to London. And, and my parents were like, oh, well, that's big dreams for a 17-year-old. And how exactly you plan to pay for that trip? And I said, well, if I get a summer job, maybe I'll make the money to go. So it was basically, I wanted to take on a summer job so I could get to London and watch a musical. Is the story there. And eventually I did find a summer job. That summer job led to a job in a newsroom the following year. And it was just interning. And then the internship became, would you like a full-time role when you're done with university? And at that point, we were the youngest. There was 3 of us that were taken from the school that I was at, and we were doing the hourly news bulletins because CNN at that time was new and it was 24-hour news, and they needed basically young blood to sit there and watch 24-hour news and pull out headlines that might be relevant or of interest to a Filipino audience, and then recycle that or shorten it and deliver it for the local audience. And that's what I did for, the first few years after university, and that led to other things, and the next thing I knew, I was a journalist. Volcano erupted, I got sent to cover that. Earthquakes, flash floods, and then, so of course, back then, the big goal was to one day work for the big international news network, which was CNN. But through the local work I was doing in the Philippines, I got a scholarship with the British Council. Got sent to London, did my master's in London. It was actually related to storytelling because at that point I'd been working as a reporter for 7 years. And what I wanted to do was focus on the art and craft of narrative, of how to tell a story in a way that makes somebody that you're speaking to care, or how to elicit empathy in your audience, in your viewer, in your reader. Because if you don't do that, then I feel like you're not doing the job as it should be done. That's always how I've seen a reporter's role. You are there to bear witness, and in bearing witness, transmit the story in such a way that somebody who might be watching from halfway around the world realizes that what they're seeing is happening to brethren, is happening to somebody who is not any different to them. Yeah. And so that was basically it. I did my master's in the UK, ended up getting a job at CNN, which at that point was my big dream come true, and stayed on in the UK for a decade. And then only left when there was a new network that was opening up, and the opportunity was there to set up a bureau and tell the stories from this side of the world, having now gained the perspective of having lived abroad. And so I did that. I came here and worked for Al Jazeera for the next 11 years.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think it's always really sort of good to hear, because people get a big break, and with you, I think it says on your website, which there's lots of fascinating stories on there. If any of our listeners want to go and have a look, it's margaortigas.com. margaortigas.com, that your sort of first real big story that you broke or was the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. But there's always, before the big break, there's always a lot of grafting that's gone on.
Yes.
Sort of before that. You have to be in the right place and
Yes.
position yourself to get
Yes.
the big break. They don't just happen
Yes.
by themselves. But I love what you're saying about being a storyteller, because that's something that I've become increasingly conscious of in my preaching. I think when I was a young, zealous student brother, I like to think that I'm still zealous. I'm definitely not young, but that let's not pansy around with stories. Let's tell it like it is. And then
Yes.
started to come to this realization. Well, Jesus was one of the great storytellers, if not the greatest storyteller
Yeah.
of all time. Look at the way that he conveys truths, and I realized that the way that I was trying to teach and the way that Jesus was teaching were at odds, and that I'm probably better picking his side if I'm looking for a good way to teach. So I'd love to study like storytelling and the craft of storytelling
Yes.
at a like proper level in the way that you have.
It was completely eye-opening for me. I mean, every time somebody asks, "Oh, where did you grow up?" and it's so easy to say, "Oh, I was raised in the Philippines. I was raised in Manila." But I really feel like my growing up years was that decade I spent in London. I was in my early 20s. By the time I left London, I was in my early mid 30s, and those years were just that changed me a lot, and I learned so much about the world and about people and about looking through a very different lens than that which I had grown up with. And I just credit being there so much with seeing the world as a much larger, but at the same time much smaller place, where it was less frightening. And it was really the fact that, London particularly is a very cosmopolitan city, in that you can be riding the tube and you've got 20 different nationalities sitting next to you in the same carriage, and yet you're all doing the same thing. You might be all going to work, or you might, that whole shared sense of adventure. And yeah, I carry that with me always, I think, in everything that I do.
Yeah. We're going to go to our first piece of music now. I think so appropriately, given some of the stories and the bent that sort of Marga's career has taken. We're going to listen to Earthkeeper by Bukas Palad, and I say that because she's done a lot of work and stories around the effect of typhoons, drought, rising sea levels, and the plight of climate refugees. And I'm going to ask Marga about some of the stories that she's found most interesting to work on and most sort of proud on having brought to the public's attention after this piece of music. If you want to donate to help raise money for Radio Maria Philippines, then the number to call is 0300 302 1251. That's 0300 302 1251. This is Earthkeeper by Bukas Palad.
You were meant to be free, as wild as
You are listening to Radio Maria, and this is day 2 of our marathon raising money for Radio Maria in the Philippines. The number, if you want to donate, and we have people on the phone lines ready to take your call, is 0300 302 1251. That's 0300 302 1251. Or you can go on the website to donate, www.radiomariaengland.uk. I am speaking now to Marga Ortigas, who is a renowned journalist who's worked all over the world. She's also published author. She's got 4 books, most recently Woman Turning 50 Postcards from a Midlife Crisis in Progress, which I really like that title. So I hope the crisis is complete sometime soon.
Yeah.
It's
inside quotation marks, so it's not really a crisis.
Excellent. Good. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I'd love to know about some of the stories that you're most proud about working on and breaking to the world, and also something of what goes on behind the scenes in bringing stories like this to the screen.
You know, the thing is, being based particularly in the Philippines, Southeast Asia was the patch I covered more broadly for Al Jazeera, but they also sent me to the Middle East, and I even reported from the United States and South America. So you're really kind of traveling everywhere, but most of my time was really spent covering climate disasters. So there was a lot of typhoons, there were a lot of droughts, there were flash floods, and there were earthquakes, though not directly related to climate change, was still exacerbated by, there was one particular area, there was I think a quake that led to a volcanic eruption, and then it was rainy season, so that led to flash floods, and all of the ash and the pyroclastic material that was on the side of the slopes of the volcano just came tumbling down. So my work for news, in a way, was bookended by huge volcanic eruptions, or the anticipation of a huge volcanic eruption, and constantly having to see people in agricultural areas who didn't have the luxury of being able to afford, let's say, not to work their farms every day, having to survive in refugee centers for unpredictable amounts of time, because the local government obviously would not want them to return to their farms because it wasn't safe enough yet. And that happens way more frequently than many people who don't live in tropical countries realize. It's almost now part of the yearly calendar. Oh, volcano season, or it's rainy season, or indeed it might take turns with drought season. All of which means that large numbers of people struggle to survive even more than they already do, perhaps subsisting below the economic average to be considered even just upwardly mobile, these days. The local governments have become more adept at helping their communities deal with it, because obviously things are just expected to get worse as the climate crisis deepens and just gets more profound. They have no other choice but to learn to live with the flash floods and the typhoons, which are becoming more and more frequent. And there used to be typhoon season in the Philippines, so you kind of knew when it was going to be raining. That doesn't happen like that anymore. And the storms are no longer hitting only the same areas as they used to before, because it can now strike anywhere. The southern Philippines, which used to be generally free from super typhoons, is now one of the most affected areas, and usually across the Christmas season, which never used to happen. You used to see rains here, June, July, August. Now you might expect it October, November, in fact, even December. There have been, I have had to cover superstorms at Christmas time, and it's just, yeah. So it's not getting easier. Local communities are getting more adaptable, or they're learning to adapt more to these situations. But really, radio stations like Radio Maria, for example, are a great help in times like that, because there is no television. In fact, you might not even have your phone signal working, but everybody, anywhere you go in the Philippines, will be listening to radio. for example. So when one of the largest networks across the Philippines was shut down by the previous government, it was a great disservice, I feel, to the Filipino communities, particularly in far-flung areas, who relied on a local national network to be told like where areas were safe or where there might be food, or even just news of, hey, there's a storm coming, or there's this that's expected soon. So when the biggest national network, media network, is taken down by the government for really political reasons, it's a disservice to the community. And yeah, so anything to help really keep mass communications like radios, stations, and whatnot going is much needed right now. So it's also me calling for donations to help Radio Maria Philippines.
Well, thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, and even in England, just in a very trivial way compared to what people experience in the Philippines. But I really do have the impression that we've lost our distinct seasons. We're not getting massively extreme weather, but something of the distinctness of the seasons seems to have gone to me. Now, one of the stories that you've got on your website is sort of pollution and the next generation, the high cost of progress, and that's a big sort of tension in the world, isn't it, now, between sort of developed economies and around climate change, saying, well, it's the developing world that's causing most of the increase in emissions now, so why should we change? And other people saying, well, you've done all your industrial revolution and progress. Yeah. What tends to be the attitude of people in the Philippines around, say, the causes of environmental pollution?
Yes, there's a very big movement here now to get people using solar energy, for example, which for the last few years was a very expensive endeavor. So not many people were able to do it because it was just too expensive. But of course, we're right by the equator. It's very, very, like right now, it's like 36 degrees Celsius. It's hot. There's a lot of sun. When it's not raining, it's very sunny. So there is a lot of wind energy and there's a lot of solar energy. And more you have companies who are trying to harness those natural resources so that we are no longer as dependent on fossil fuels, for example. But there is still that. People are still using diesel engine cars. You are not going to see electric cars in the city anytime soon where they are even 50% of the vehicular population. And that's because it's just still too expensive. The Philippines is getting there slowly, but they're not there yet. And unlike the neighbors that we have here in the Pacific, Palau, for example, if I recall correctly, tried to sue the more industrialized nations because basically it's like the countries here in the Pacific, the islands are paying for, indeed, as you said, the industrial revolution that took place in the West before it took place here and depleted the earth of resources that is now causing what we're seeing, But things are changing slowly, because it's still expensive, but it's getting there because more and more people are conscious of what's happening. The internet is also to be thanked for that because information is more readily available. So people can read more, find out things on their own, and not just believe what could be fed to them by their governments or indeed by what they see on television.
Yeah.
So
I'd love to just touch on something that you've mentioned there at the end about information being more readily available, but then having also spoken about the clamp down on radio in the Philippines. Do you have any sense of where you think the future of journalism is going, and what, I know this is a massive question, but what the media landscape might look like in 10, 15 years time? I was reading a very interesting article by a man called Ted Goya, who is a sort of philosopher of media, and he spoke about how the way that not so much in the news corporations, but the big internet players, that they're all building walls. So they're doing everything they can to stop people from leaving like their environment, their little sort of Google city state.
Yeah.
And you see one example that where people are realizing what's going on now. I just saw a piece by a journalist. And in writing about Substack on another platform, she put a whole load of asterisks in because she knew that if her piece had Substack written in it, then it wouldn't get as much profile on a provider that doesn't own Substack.
Yes. No, you're absolutely right. And that's the thing. I think everybody now has the capacity to become their own broadcast network. You know, whereas before, for example, my generation, you grow up aiming to join a particular industry leader, you know, the big network with a big name. People don't do that anymore. People become their own brand. They become their own media platform. And as much as, like, as you mentioned, there's Substack, there's Medium, right? There's Reddit. There's all sorts of fora right now where people can go and create their own little communities and form their own bubbles. And the thing there for us digital users now is I think everybody has the responsibility to educate themselves in terms of what it is you're listening to or what it is you're reading. Because it's so easy now to just read something online and think it's real. Worse with AI, they put video and you don't know if it's real or fake. So if you don't educate yourselves into being able to distinguish what is true, what is not true, who might be spouting out propaganda, or who might be pushing something completely false, then you can't really blame anybody else now but yourself, is how I feel. Because if everybody's saying, oh, but this is the truth, this is the truth, they all have their own versions of the story, right? And I think as the consumer of the information, what I have to do now is every time I read something, I always check who wrote this. You know, what was the what page was it on? Was it on Substack? What is the background of the person who put this here? Where did this come from? And then I might look at other things that they've written so I understand a bit more about the writer or about the person who was reporting the information to you, because you can't just take everything for fact now, unfortunately. There used to be gatekeepers, there aren't that anymore.
Yeah,
because even the gatekeepers are protecting certain things, you know, so yeah.
Well, that used to be your sort of that, you know, you had journalists who were famous on particular channels, but the channel was this, and the editorial controls that are going on behind the scenes were your guarantor that this is trustworthy. You can rely on that. And I think the erosion of trust is really, really dangerous for modern society. I've been watching a documentary on the Vietnam War at the moment, and the really, really important role that journalists played in that, in essentially revealing to Americans that their government was lying to them, and was just like spoon feeding them propaganda that didn't really like relate to what was happening on the ground. But like that obviously then caused a massive erosion of trust, and in many ways leads to the contemporary sort of political environment that we have now. You can see its origins in Vietnam. You can probably see it earlier if you wanted to. So it's fascinating to hear your thoughts on what you do, and I'd encourage anybody to sort of be as diligent in not just taking everything at face value.
Yes.
I want in the little bit of time that we have remaining, I'd love to maybe any words of advice for a young aspiring journalist who might be listening now.
For me, it's keep going, you know, and not to take anything at face value, because it's very easy now to fold when confronted with a powerful politician who will just look at you if they don't like the question that you're asking and say, you're lying, that's fake news, you know, that's a stupid question, I want you out of my press briefing, for example. And for many people, it's a frightening thing to be in a space where you're bullied and treated like what you have to say, or the fact that you're actually meant to be there as a representative of the public, calling people who are in positions of power to account for their actions. And somehow the world has gotten so the journalist is now the bad guy. You know, the truth seeker, or at least the role that they're supposed to be playing as truth seekers, has now been spun around, where immediately people hear your press and they look at you like you're worse than, I don't know, you know, like you're some sort of irresponsible shyster who's just out to twist the story to get some thing that you can't even imagine what it is they think you want out of it pushed forward. It's a bit insane, but we need truth seekers. We need people who can put a story out there that is impartial, where it is not biased towards one or the other, or where you are just serving propaganda up as if it were fact, so yes, and I hope that people don't just give up and take what they're given as truth without questioning first where it comes from and who has put it out there. So for any young person who wants to become a journalist, read as much as you can, observe the world, and don't just take everything at face value.
That's wonderful. I saw a little thing which was a beautiful sort of act of solidarity between some journalists a while ago, where a politician, I forget where it was, but he said, "I'm not taking a question from you, anyone else." And the other journalists said, well, if you're not going to take questions from them, even though maybe some of these other journalists agreed more with the political line of this politician, they said, if you're not taking questions from them, then you're not getting questions from any of us. And they all walked off the interview.
Yes, that's brilliant. And unfortunately, we don't see enough of that. And you kind of do. I mean, when I spent a year in Baghdad, in the early noughties. And there really was back then a sense of community, even amongst the journalists who might have been working for competing networks or competing news agencies. I think because it was in the middle of a conflict, so there was life and death situations, and yet we all saw each other as part of the same team, if you were. So people had each other's backs. If a story might have been deemed too sensationalist or too morbid to be put on air, we all covered it in a way that was respectful. And there was nobody trying to outmaneuver anybody else to get the story out first. There was none of that. This was, of course, 20-something years ago. And things have changed a lot since then. But, yeah, simpler times in a way, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. Marga, it's been so fascinating and a real delight to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time. If people want to see some of Marga's work for themselves, you can go on her website, margaortigas.com, where you can see various videos of some of her stories and also the books that she has written. As we said, most recently, Woman Turning 50, Postcards from a Midlife in speech marks crisis in progress. But our prayers for you in what you do, Marga, because as someone who Radio Maria listeners are a big fan of, once said, the truth will set you free. So it matters the stories that we tell. We're going to listen now. Thank you
very much.
That's a pleasure. We're going to listen to and I'm going to get you to see whether you can translate this for our listeners on the basis of my dodgy pronunciation. Pagbabalik?
Pagbabalik?
Yeah, that'd be it.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Pagbabalik means the return.
The return. Excellent.
Yes.
Okay, well, Marga, thank you so much for your time with us.
Thank you very much.
God bless
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
You are listening to Radio Maria, and this is day 2 of our marathon raising money for Radio Maria in the Philippines. The number, if you want to